The town of Hollow Grove had always carried an eerie reputation, its narrow streets often shrouded in a mist that clung to the cobblestones like ghostly veils. Few dared to speak of the decrepit house perched atop Whispering Hill, its silhouette a jagged scar against the twilight sky, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to reach out with skeletal branches. Known ominously as the house that screamed at dusk, it was said to have claimed the lives of all who entered after the sun sank below the horizon. No one knew where the legend began, but the tales of sudden screams and flickering lights in the windows made even the bravest townsfolk steer clear. Except for Melanie. Melanie, a journalist seeking the truth behind urban legends, arrived in Hollow Grove with her camera and notepad. Driven by a relentless curiosity and a childhood fascination with ghost stories, she had made a career out of unraveling mysteries that others feared to touch. Her determination was fueled by an incident years ago, when a supposedly haunted bridge turned out to be a smuggling route, a discovery that launched her into investigative fame. Hollow Grove, with its chilling reputation, felt like the perfect challenge to prove her skills once more. Determined to debunk the myths surrounding the house, she rented a small room in the town and began interviewing locals. Each story added to the dread that built like a storm cloud in her chest. "My grandfather told me the house belonged to a man named Arthur Marlowe," said Mrs. Hargrove, the town's oldest resident. "He was a recluse, a collector of strange artifacts from across the world. One night, there was a fire, and Arthur's body was never found. But his screams, oh, his screams, child, they say you can still hear them at dusk." Others told her of missing teenagers, unexplained shadows, and the disembodied voices of children singing nursery rhymes. Melanie remained skeptical, dismissing the stories as exaggerations of small-town superstition. But the whispers in the town square, the fearful glances toward Whispering Hill, and the peculiar chill that gripped the air at dusk began to gnaw at her resolve. The house itself was a rotting husk of its former grandeur. The air surrounding it carried a pungent mix of damp earth and decaying wood, and faint creaks echoed from within as if the building was alive and breathing. Ivy clawed its way up the walls, the windows were dark and shattered, and the faint sound of wind whispering through the cracks seemed to form incoherent words that sent shivers down Melanie's spine. Ivy clawed its way up the walls, the windows were dark and shattered, and the porch sagged like a tired old man. Yet, as Melanie stood before it that evening, the last rays of sunlight bathing it in an ominous orange glow, she felt an inexplicable pull. She shook off the unease and entered, the door creaking loudly as if the house were exhaling. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with mildew. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and cobwebs draped the corners like ghostly curtains. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing torn wallpaper and furniture, covered in dust and mold. Despite the oppressive silence, Melanie began snapping pictures and jotting down notes. Her first jump scare came from a sudden clatter upstairs. Melanie's heart leaped as she swung her flashlight toward the staircase. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. Convinced it was a raccoon or some other animal, she cautiously ascended. Each step groaned louder than the last, as if protesting her intrusion. The upstairs hallway was a maze of doors, some ajar and others sealed shut with layers of grime. Melanie chose the nearest open door and stepped inside. It was a child's bedroom. The faded wallpaper depicted playful clowns, their cheerful faces now unsettling in the dim light. A crib sat in the corner, its mattress missing. A doll lay on the floor, its glassy eyes reflecting her flashlight beam. As Melanie picked up the doll for a closer look, its head snapped toward her, and a mechanical giggle escaped its lips. She let out a strangled scream, her breath catching as she dropped the doll. Stumbling backward, her flashlight beam wavered across the walls, amplifying the room's already unsettling shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest as the giggle intensified, echoing unnaturally around her, like it was coming from every corner at once. Frozen in terror, she stared at the doll, now lying still, its glassy eyes seemingly mocking her. A cold sweat trickled down her back, and she whispered shakily to herself, "This can't be real." She dropped it with a gasp, stumbling backward. The giggle echoed unnaturally, growing louder until it seemed to fill the entire room. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. "Get it together, Melanie," she muttered, her voice quivering. She left the room and continued down the hall. Another open door revealed a study filled with bookshelves. Her flashlight landed on a desk where a thick, leather-bound journal sat open, its pages yellowed with age. Curious, Melanie approached and began to read. The entries were cryptic, detailing strange rituals and invocations. One passage caught her eye. "They say the house hungers for those who enter, feeding on their fears and drawing them deeper. Only at dusk does it awaken fully. Only at dusk does it scream." A sudden scraping sound from behind her made her whirl around. One of the books had fallen from the shelf. The room's temperature dropped sharply, her breath now visible in the beam of her flashlight. As she bent to pick up the book, a whisper brushed against her ear, "Leave." Melanie's blood ran cold. She spun around, but no one was there. Panic set in, but her stubborn determination pushed her forward. She had to uncover the truth. She made her way back downstairs, her footsteps quick and uneven. When she reached the living room, she froze. The front door, which she had left ajar, was now shut tight. As she approached the door to leave, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It was as if the house itself was crying out. Melanie clutched her chest, her heart pounding wildly. The sound seemed to emanate from every wall, every floorboard. Covering her ears, she stumbled backward, only to trip over a loose rug. When she hit the ground, she looked up and saw the shadows on the ceiling coalescing, forming grotesque, writhing shapes. The shadows began to descend, crawling down the walls like living creatures. Melanie scrambled to her feet, her flashlight flickering wildly. She ran toward the kitchen, hoping to find another exit. The air grew heavier, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. In the kitchen, the windows were boarded up, and the back door was locked tight. Melanie's hands shook as she tugged at the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the shadows spilled into the room, their forms growing more defined. One resembled a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, another, a childlike figure with elongated limbs. The gaunt man stepped forward, its bony hand reaching out. "Melanie," it rasped, its voice a guttural growl. She screamed and swung her flashlight at the apparition, but it passed through harmlessly. Desperation clawed at her as she turned and bolted up the stairs, her only thought to put distance between herself and the horrors below. She burst into the master bedroom and slammed the door shut, leaning against it as she struggled to catch her breath. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The only light came from the window, where the last traces of dusk blurred into night. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the closet. Melanie's throat tightened, and tears streamed down her face. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. Slowly, the closet door creaked open. Melanie's flashlight sputtered back to life, illuminating the empty closet. But as she stepped closer, the walls of the closet seemed to stretch endlessly, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase descending into the earth. Against every instinct screaming at her to flee, Melanie stepped into the closet. Her mind raced with doubts, each step forward a battle between reason and an inexplicable compulsion. Was she driven by the relentless pursuit of truth, or was it sheer desperation to escape the horrors behind her? The air grew colder as she hesitated at the threshold, her breath catching in her throat. She thought of the stories she had dismissed, the warnings she had ignored. What if they were right? Yet, her legs moved forward, as if the house itself demanded her presence. Each creak of the floor beneath her feet felt like a mocking taunt, daring her to turn back before it was too late. The staircase seemed to pull her downward, the air growing colder with each step. The screams from above faded, replaced by a low, guttural hum. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a cavernous room lit by faintly glowing symbols carved into the walls. In the center of the room stood a stone altar. On it lay a journal, identical to the one she had found earlier. As Melanie approached, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Arthur Marlowe standing there, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes void of humanity. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The house is alive. It feeds on those who disturb it." Melanie backed away, her mind racing. "Why haven't you left?" she asked, her voice trembling. Arthur smiled, a grotesque and hollow expression that stretched unnaturally across his gaunt face. His skin was ashen and taut, clinging to his skull like parchment, with deep, shadowy hollows where his eyes should have been. Cracks ran along his cheeks, oozing a dark, viscous fluid, and his teeth, jagged and uneven, glinted like shards of broken glass. The sight of him was otherworldly, a macabre blend of decay and malice that made Melanie's stomach churn. "I am the house, and now so are you." Before Melanie could scream, the symbols on the walls flared brightly. Pain erupted through her body as the room began to collapse inward. The walls became flesh, the floor a pulsing, living thing. The house itself consumed her, her screams joining the cacophony that echoed through its halls. When dawn broke, the house stood silent once more. The townsfolk noticed Melanie's car still parked at the base of Whispering Hill, but dared not investigate. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a new scream joined the others, piercing the twilight and sending shivers down the spines of all who heard it. The house that screamed at dusk had claimed another victim.